Every major shift in global power begins with a paradox, where nations appear most stable just as the foundations beneath them begin to weaken. History shows that confidence often peaks at the same moment structural risks become impossible to reverse. In the late stages of every dominant economic era, growth looks strong on the surface while imbalances quietly expand underneath. This contradiction has appeared before the fall of empires, reserve currencies, and global financial orders. Before World War I, Britain controlled global trade routes, finance, and the world's reserve currency through the pound sterling. Yet by 1913, its debt burden and overseas commitments were already straining a system built for a different century. In the 1920s, the United States emerged as the world's leading creditor nation, while Europe struggled under war debts and reparations. Less than a decade later, the Great Depression exposed how fragile credit-fueled prosperity had become. Economic history repeatedly shows that collapse does not begin with panic, but with normalization of excess. When rising debt and monetary expansion feel routine, warning signals are often dismissed as temporary noise. Governments rarely lose power because they lack resources at the start of decline. They lose power because obligations grow faster than the productive base supporting them. In 1971, the United States ended the gold convertibility of the dollar, marking a fundamental shift in the global monetary system. At the time, this decision was framed as technical, yet it quietly altered the rules governing trust and discipline. Reserve currencies do not fail suddenly through collapse alone. They weaken gradually as fiscal demands increase and monetary flexibility replaces constraint. The most dangerous moment in any financial system is when stability appears guaranteed. This is when leverage expands, risk pricing deteriorates, and long-term consequences are pushed forward. Debt itself is not the enemy of growth. The danger emerges when borrowing shifts from productive investment to sustaining existing systems that can no longer pay for themselves. History shows that once debt growth becomes structural rather than cyclical, monetary authorities face limited choices. They must either allow instability or absorb pressure through currency debasement and financial repression. Inflation has often acted as the silent mechanism that resolves excessive debt. While politically easier than default, it redistributes losses across society in uneven and often destabilizing ways. Global power transitions rarely announce themselves with headlines. They unfold through balance sheets, interest costs, and the gradual erosion of purchasing power. When confidence remains high despite deteriorating fundamentals, the gap between perception and reality widens. That gap is where systemic risk quietly accumulates. Every dominant system believes its circumstances are unique. The evidence from centuries of economic history suggests otherwise. What follows is not a prediction, but a pattern, repeated across nations, currencies, and eras. Understanding this pattern is essential to understanding why global power is shifting faster than ever. The pattern behind global power shifts is not mysterious, but it is often misunderstood because it unfolds slowly. Economic dominance rises through productivity and discipline, then weakens through excess borrowing and policy distortion. At the core of every major shift is a simple mechanism where debt grows faster than income. When this imbalance persists, financial systems compensate by expanding credit rather than correcting fundamentals. Credit expansion creates the illusion of strength by pulling future growth into the present. Over time, this strategy leaves economies dependent on continuous borrowing just to maintain stability. As debt accumulates, governments face rising interest obligations that compete with public spending. This pressure incentivizes policies that suppress rates rather than reduce liabilities. Central banks historically step in when debt markets become unstable. By lowering interest rates or purchasing government bonds, they transfer risk from markets to monetary systems. This intervention delays crisis but alters incentives. Borrowing becomes easier, savings lose value, and leverage increases across the economy. Eventually, monetary policy shifts from guiding markets to supporting them. At that point, price signals weaken and risk becomes mispriced on a systemic scale. Reserve currency status amplifies this pattern. Nations issuing globally accepted currencies can borrow more cheaply and for longer than others. This privilege allows imbalances to grow larger before consequences appear. However, it does not eliminate the underlying arithmetic of debt sustainability. Historically, reserve currency nations accumulate obligations faster because demand for their assets remains strong. Foreign savings flow inward, financing deficits while masking internal weakness. Over time, the domestic economy shifts from production toward finance and consumption. This transition reduces long-term growth capacity while increasing reliance on capital inflows. As productivity slows, debt growth fills the gap. The system becomes stable only as long as confidence remains intact. When confidence weakens, even slightly, the adjustment process accelerates. Capital flows reverse, currencies face pressure, and interest costs rise. To prevent instability, authorities often respond with further monetary easing. This response protects short-term stability at the expense of long-term credibility. Inflation emerges not as an accident, but as a release valve. It reduces the real value of debt while redistributing losses across society. This sequence has repeated across centuries with different technologies and institutions. The names change, but the mechanism remains consistent. Understanding this framework explains why power shifts feel sudden even though they are decades in the making. By the time effects are visible, the causes are deeply embedded. The most instructive historical example of economic overextension occurred during the decline of the British Empire in the early 20th century. Britain entered World War I in 1914 as the world's financial center, yet exited the conflict heavily indebted and structurally weakened. Before the war, London financed global trade, ensured shipping, and anchored the gold-based monetary system. That dominance depended on fiscal discipline and confidence in the pound sterling. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain suspended the gold standard to finance military spending. Government debt rose from roughly 25% of GDP in 1913 to over 135% by 1920. To service these obligations, Britain relied on inflation and foreign borrowing, particularly from the United States. This marked a reversal from creditor to debtor status within a single decade. In 1925, Britain attempted to restore the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This decision overvalued the pound and made British exports uncompetitive. As trade deficits widened, gold reserves drained from the Bank of England. Defending the currency required high interest rates that suppressed domestic growth. Unemployment remained persistently high throughout the late 1920s. Industrial output stagnated while debt obligations remained fixed. The global shock of the Great Depression intensified existing weaknesses. In 1931, Britain abandoned the gold standard permanently under market pressure. The pound sterling immediately depreciated by roughly 25%. While this provided short-term relief, it signaled the end of sterling's dominance as a global reserve currency. Financial leadership gradually shifted to the United States. New York replaced London as the center of global capital markets. This transition was not sudden, but cumulative. It reflected years of fiscal strain, policy missteps, and declining competitiveness. Britain's experience illustrates how war financing accelerates structural imbalance. Monetary flexibility postponed adjustment, but could not prevent loss of status. The decline did not involve collapse or default. It involved erosion through inflation, currency depreciation, and reduced influence. By the mid-20th century, sterling no longer anchored the global system. The dollar assumed that role under the Bretton Woods framework in 1944. The underlying lesson is not about war alone. It is about how debt, currency credibility, and global trust interact over time. Once reserve status weakens, recovery becomes difficult. Confidence migrates towards systems with stronger balance sheets and growth potential. This case demonstrates that global power shifts are economic before they are political. The financial transition precedes the visible geopolitical one. The same structural pattern now appears within the modern global financial system, though on a much larger scale. What once unfolded within individual empires is now distributed across interconnected economies. Since the 2008 financial crisis, global debt has expanded at an unprecedented pace. By 2023, total global debt exceeded 330% of world GDP, according to data from international financial institutions. Advanced economies drove much of this expansion through sustained fiscal deficits. Low interest rates made borrowing appear manageable even as absolute debt levels surged. Central banks responded to repeated shocks by expanding balance sheets. Between 2008 and 2022, major central banks collectively added tens of trillions of dollars in assets. These policies stabilized markets during crises, but altered long-term incentives. Governments learned that borrowing could be extended with limited immediate consequences. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this trajectory. Fiscal stimulus programs in 2020 alone exceeded those used during the global financial crisis. Public debt in the United States rose from approximately 106% of GDP in 2019 to over 120% by 2021. Similar increases occurred across Europe and parts of Asia. At the same time, inflation returned after decades of relative stability. By 2022, consumer inflation in many advanced economies reached levels not seen since the early 1980s. Central banks responded by raising interest rates rapidly. This shift exposed how sensitive highly leveraged systems had become to borrowing costs. Interest expenses on government debt began rising sharply. In several countries, debt servicing costs became one of the fastest growing budget items. Reserve currency dynamics remain central to this system. The US dollar still dominates trade invoicing, foreign reserves, and global debt markets. However, diversification pressures are increasing. Several nations have reduced dollar holdings while expanding gold reserves in bilateral trade arrangements. These changes do not signal abandonment, but adjustment. They reflect risk management rather than ideological rejection. Financial sanctions and geopolitical fragmentation have reinforced this trend. Payment systems and reserves are now viewed through a strategic lens. Meanwhile, productivity growth in advanced economies has slowed. Aging populations and capital misallocation constrain long-term output. As growth weakens, debt sustainability depends increasingly on monetary support. This tightens the link between fiscal policy and central banking. The modern system remains stable, but stability now relies on confidence rather than constraint. That distinction defines the current stage of the cycle. If the current trajectory continues, the consequences are likely to emerge gradually rather than through sudden collapse. Economic strain typically appears first in living standards, not in headlines. Persistent inflation acts as a hidden tax on households. While wages adjust slowly, the cost of essentials responds quickly to monetary expansion. As purchasing power erodes, savings lose real value. This undermines long-term financial security without requiring formal default. Governments facing rising debt costs often turn to financial repression. This includes keeping interest rates below inflation to manage liabilities. Such policies transfer resources from savers to borrowers. Over time, this distorts capital allocation across the economy. Banking systems adapt by holding larger quantities of government debt. This tightens the link between sovereign risk and financial stability. When banks and governments depend on each other for solvency, systemic fragility increases. Shocks then propagate faster across institutions. Global trade also becomes affected. Currency volatility complicates pricing, contracts, and investment planning. Emerging markets feel these pressures more acutely. Capital flows reverse quickly when global financing conditions tighten. Historically, this environment leads to slower growth rather than immediate crisis. Economies stagnate under the weight of accumulated obligations. Political pressure often rises as economic flexibility declines. Policy choices narrow as debt servicing consumes fiscal space. International cooperation becomes harder during such periods. Nations prioritize domestic stability over global coordination. Reserve currency issuers retain advantages, but those advantages diminish over time. Trust becomes more conditional and less automatic. The shift does not eliminate the existing system. It weakens it through gradual redistribution of influence. This process reshapes global power without dramatic rupture. Economic leadership disperses rather than collapses outright. The end result is a more fragmented financial world. Stability persists, but it becomes harder to maintain and easier to disrupt. These outcomes reflect arithmetic, not ideology. When debt grows faster than productive capacity, adjustment becomes unavoidable. The final insight of every major economic transition is that power rarely disappears, but instead relocates. Monetary systems evolve not through collapse alone, but through rebalancing driven by incentives and constraints. History shows that reserve currencies fade through gradual loss of trust rather than sudden rejection. Confidence weakens as alternatives become safer, cheaper, or more stable over time. The dominant mistake is assuming that past success guarantees future stability. Economic leadership is maintained through discipline, not legacy. Periods of transition often feel confusing because no single event marks the turning point. The shift occurs across years through policy responses to accumulating pressure. Debt-heavy systems rely increasingly on perception rather than fundamentals. Once credibility requires constant support, resilience has already declined. This does not imply imminent failure. It implies reduced margin for error. Global power today is not collapsing. It is diffusing across regions with stronger balance sheets and growth potential. Financial influence follows productivity, savings, and institutional credibility. These forces operate quietly but relentlessly. Modern economies remain capable of adaptation. However, adaptation requires recognizing limits rather than extending excess. The lesson from history is not pessimism, but clarity. Systems that adjust early preserve influence longer. Those that delay adjustment trade short-term stability for long-term erosion. The cost is paid gradually through inflation, stagnation, and reduced leverage. Understanding this cycle reframes how economic strength should be measured. Power is less about scale and more about sustainability. The fastest shifts occur when arithmetic overtakes narrative. At that moment, policy options narrow rapidly. What appears sudden to observers is predictable to history. The data always moves first. Global power is shifting faster than ever because the system supporting it is under unprecedented strain. The transition is not ending stability, but redefining where it resides. This is how economic orders change. Quietly, structurally, and long before most recognize the shift is complete.